the talk online is listed in the chat by Kelly Shea as the first chat for this meeting. We're very pleased to have Alan B. Carr as our Institute for Material Science Summer Seminars Series speaker. His content is so useful for us in our program that we invited him to give 2 talks, one today and then one tomorrow at the exact same time, 1:30 to 2:30. Alan Carr was hired by Los Alamos National Laboratory in 2003 after completing his graduate work at Texas Tech University. He's currently the lab's senior historian and program manager. Anything relating to history of Los Alamos, Alan knows it. And he gives a bunch of wonderful talks. We've selected 2 from his repertoire for today and tomorrow. As a historian, he has appraised thousands of sets of records held by laboratory organizations for their historical value. And over the years, Alan has produced several publications pertaining to the Manhattan Project, nuclear weapons testing, and the laboratory's development during the Cold War years. He's lectured for numerous professional organizations and has been featured as a guest on many local, national, and international radio and television programs. He currently serves as a program manager and the senior historian for Los Alamos National Laboratory. And as a reminder to everyone, Alan has really a lot of content for today's talk. Please hold your questions until the end, and please enter your questions in the chat, and we'll have a Q&A session afterwards. Hey, Alan.
All righty, Michael. Hey, thanks. How y'all doing? Well, I guess I can't hear you since you're all muted, but you can put that in chat if you'd like to share with everybody else. I'm doing great, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here with you today. And so let me see, where do we start? We've got a 2-part talk, 1 hour today, 1 hour tomorrow. And good, I love the feedback. You know, I'll probably have some questions as we go through the talk. And so interact in chat. Let me know what you're up to. Let me know what you think. Let me put down some disclaimers for my talk. If you've been to one of my talks before, you've probably heard some of the disclaimers. The Manhattan Project. So some of the history that we'll be covering over the next couple of days is considered controversial. There is a lot of subjective history. So do take into account a few things as we begin. First of all, you might want to take into account who pays me. I get paid by the laboratory. I'm an American. You're probably going to get a perspective kind of from the lab and the American perspective. And guess what? There are a lot of perspectives on this history. We won't have time to go through them all. I'm certainly not an expert of all of them, but you might have some observations, some stories that you want to share in chat, maybe during Q&A at the end of today, at the end of tomorrow. Let me encourage you strongly to take advantage of that and to share. You know, my talks are very much a reflection of what I've learned over the years, what I've learned in Q&A, and from people who've given me comments over the years. Another thing is, if you catch something that I got wrong, be sure and correct me in chat. I really appreciate those corrections in particular there as well. And of course, we're covering something that lasted multiple years in only 2 hours. And so I'm only giving you a little bit of the story, and you might want to ask yourself, what's Alan leaving out of the story? Why is he leaving it out of the story? And so those are kind of the basic disclaimers as we get into the talk today. Don't be afraid, and one last thing, don't be afraid to ask me those tough questions. We are going to be talking about things like Trinity, which was a remarkable experiment, but also there was fallout produced. Some of that here in New Mexico, some of that story remains controversial today. We'll talk about Trinity tomorrow, but if you want to go ahead and ask me questions about that today during Q&A, that'd be fine if you want to get that head start. And of course, atomic weapons were used at the end of the war. Still highly controversial. Don't be afraid to ask me those tough questions. Maybe you've heard things that I didn't or won't cover in the talk that you'd like to discuss. And so again, let's get it all out there. All right. Let's start up our talk by going back in time to 1939. And my talks are basically chronological, but we are going to make some jumps in time. Okay. And so I will try and make it clear when we do that. We're going to start with the beginning of World War II today. Actually, let's start with the end of World War II really quickly. When we talk about the use of atomic weapons, when you take that out of its historical context, that's, well, even when you put it in its historical context, that's a pretty aggressive thing to do, isn't it? maybe about the most aggressive thing any nation could do to another nation. What I like to do when we talk about this is at least provide some historical context, so at least maybe you can understand how things got so bad, why decisions were made. Uh, that doesn't mean you have to agree with them. Again, a lot of this is subjective, but hopefully by exploring the historical context, you can understand how we unfortunately got to that point. So let's go back in time, talk about the outbreak of World War II. So hopefully everybody knows who Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin are. That's a prerequisite for the talk today. There's Hitler on the left on the screen right now, and Joseph Stalin over on the right. So Hitler is in charge of Nazi Germany. Stalin is in charge of the Soviet Union. Now, when I mention names like Adolf Hitler, when I mention things like Nazi Germany, of course, there are probably going to be some pretty horrific images that come into your imaginations there. Uh, as we start our talk about nuclear weapons, I want everybody to imagine this. Imagine a world in which Adolf Hitler has a nuclear monopoly. Hitler, the guy on the screen there on the left, he's got nuclear weapons and nobody else does. So pretty scary state of affairs there. We're going to talk a little bit about why that didn't happen, why the Manhattan Project. We'll talk a lot about why the Manhattan Project came into existence, and why it took kind of a long time for the Manhattan Project to come into existence as well. But everybody think about that for a moment. Adolf Hitler has nuclear weapons, no one else does. Okay, that'll be important down the road. World War II starts right after Hitler and Stalin sign a non-aggression pact. This is known as the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't, but a very, very important agreement. Didn't last all that long, but a very important agreement for our story, and one of the more important agreements that was signed during the 20th century, I would say as well. So these guys promised not to attack each other. They also secretly cut Poland in half, all right? And so on September 1st, 1939, the German army invades Poland, and over the next several weeks, they take their half. About 2.5 weeks later, on September 17th, the Soviet Union invades Poland as well. They take half of Poland, never give it back, by the way. Uh, we're not going to get to talk about the Cold War during this session or tomorrow either, for that matter, but if we ever do talk about the Cold War, you might file away some of the things that I'm going to talk about, because they will help you to understand why that story unfolded the way that it did. Of course, you're getting the Americans' perspective. There is a Soviet perspective, Russian perspective on this as well. That might be something you want to ask me in Q&A. What's the Soviet? What's the Russian side of things here? They're not paying me, so you don't get that in the regular part of the chat. But again, I would be happy to talk about that a little bit later if you'd like to know more, or if you'd like to share some of those perspectives and some of your stories as well. And so anyway, this is how World War II begins. Now, this was quite a shock to most people in the world. They didn't think Hitler and Stalin would be able to get along. Here they are invading Poland together all of a sudden. So this instantly destabilizes everything. Now, when the Germans invade Poland, Britain, France, they both declare war on the Germans. They don't declare war on the Soviet Union, though. I think for the British in particular, they didn't, simply because it was, can you imagine the logistics involved if you're the United Kingdom of declaring war on Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union simultaneously? It couldn't be done, but this beyond agitated the French and the British as well. That too will figure into our story in just a little while. Let's talk about what the Soviets do next. All right. So next, Stalin invades Finland. So at the time, you've got approximately 180 million people living in Russia, about 4 million people living in Finland. Who do you think is going to win when the Red Army invades Finland? The Red Army. And you would be right, kind of. And I say kind of because this was no cakewalk. You would think that, well, that would last, like, maybe the campaign would be over by brunch. The Finns fought off the Red Army for months and months for a variety of reasons. Now, I would say that the single most important reason is that Stalin had already decapitated his own military. He got rid of half of the Red Army officers in the purges of 1938, 1937, 1938, and the weaknesses of the Red Army that came into effect as a result of that were exposed when the Red Army invaded Finland. And so eventually the Red Army is able to extract some strategic tracts of Finland. You can see those highlighted on the map there. But anyway, this does a lot more harm than good for the Soviet Union, because the United States, the United Kingdom, the Germans all look at the Soviet Union and say, wow, the Soviet army, the Red Army is in awful shape. Hitler in particular starts thinking, if these guys fared that poorly against the Finns, I know we've signed a non-aggression pact, but I wonder what would happen if we invaded them. Hmm. This too will come back into our story in just a little while. But we're not finished talking about what the Soviets are up to. After they invade and extract portions of Finland, they next forcefully annex about 20% of Romania, as well as the whole of the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. So you can see all of this new border territory that Stalin has in the lightly pink shaded area there on the map. And, I'd like to mention that although we've forgotten a lot of this ancient history here in the United States, a lot of people in Eastern Europe remember this quite well, and all of these events continue to inform the policies of the nations involved today. And that's going to be the case in the Pacific when we go talk about the Pacific War in just a few more minutes. But anyway, that's what Stalin has done. He's taken a whole lot of new territory because he doesn't have to worry about Hitler attacking him because they have signed a non-aggression pact. And so what is Hitler going to do with his free time? Well, you probably know that story a little bit more because it's something that for whatever reason we talk about a lot more in the United States. The Germans invade Denmark and Norway in April of 1940, and the next month they invade Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. Now, World War II is really a series of massive strategic miscalculations, and this is one of our early ones, in that a lot of people thought if anybody could stop the Germans, if anyone could really put up a fight, it would be the French. The French, unfortunately for them, have a long track record of being invaded by Germany. They had built a wall to keep Germans out. Long story, very short. The Germans just kind of went around the wall, used Belgium as a highway, and France collapses in only 6 weeks. And so this is an unfortunate shock. Now, as France is crumbling, the Italians decide to declare war on France as well. They're going to jump in on the side of the Germans. Of course, at that time, Italy was a fascist dictatorship. A guy named Benito Mussolini was in charge, if you've heard of him. And, if you're visualizing our map from the previous slide, there's not a whole lot left to conquer in Europe for Stalin and for Hitler. They've taken almost everything. It must have been pretty lonely to be the United Kingdom at that point in time. The Germans decide that they want to try and knock out the Brits using air power alone. This has never been done before. And this is where the Battle of Britain begins. That too is an entire story. Movies and books have been written about that. But anyway, again, long story short for today, the Germans are unsuccessful. Every sortie, they're flying over the United Kingdom. They're losing pilots. They're losing planes. And you might be thinking, well, it's the last enemy. I mean, why didn't they just press the attack? Well, I know it'll surprise you, but the Germans have already decided that they are going to invade the Soviet Union and break that non-aggression pact. Now, as weak as the Soviet Union may have appeared to be, it's a big place, and you're going to need every person, every resource you can get if you're going to invade the Soviet Union. And so Hitler makes a strategic error at this point. He assumes that the United Kingdom poses no strategic threat. They've been isolated, and he simply cancels the Battle of Britain there to shift everything to the east. And as we will see, the United Kingdom becomes basically a fortress that's going to be used in attacking the Germans down the road. You all know that story. But anyway, the Germans decide to invade the Soviet Union. They're delayed a couple of times for reasons that we could talk about in Q&A if you want, but they finally invade on June 22nd, 1941. And I mean, what does the delay matter anyway, right? Because this campaign is only supposed to last 2, maybe 3 months because the Red Army is so weak. All right. So we've got more strategic miscalculations coming up on the parts of the Germans here. They've assumed that it's going to be a quick campaign. It's not. They are not prepared for a winter campaign because they're supposed to be done at the end of summer. That's not going to work out either. The Germans, make no mistake about it, this is where World War II was decided. All right, you look at the numbers, and they are just unimaginable. We'll look at some actual numbers at the end of the presentation tomorrow that will help bear out what a world war looks like. But you had roughly 7 million soldiers engaging each other from above the Arctic Circle in Finland all the way to the Black Sea. Think about that for a moment. 7 million soldiers. There's nothing in the American experience that can really compare with what's about to happen on the front between the Germans and the Russians, the Soviets. out there. So in go the Germans. They inflict something like 2 million casualties on the Soviet Union by the fall. But that's the problem. In the fall, the Red Army is still fighting. The war was supposed to be over. You would think 2 million casualties would be enough to knock pretty much any country out of any war, but that is just going to be the start of what is going to be a terrible, terrible conflict. The Germans are able to push their way all the way to the gates of Moscow. Okay, they are almost to the Soviet capital. Of course, I don't think capturing the capital would have ensured victory, but anyway, they are almost there by the end of the year, December 1941. They are at the gates of Leningrad. They're going to besiege Leningrad as well. They're pushing deep into southern Russia as well. But at Moscow, the Soviets have prepared a massive counterattack. They're going to stop the Germans and push them back a little bit. With both sides exhausted, the war is going to freeze in place in the early months of 1942. Okay, so that's where we're going to leave the action for now. The Germans are in a long, protracted war that they're not prepared for, and that's going to be kind of an ongoing theme onto our next slide. All right. And I guess I'll ask our first trivia question of the day. Now, as was mentioned earlier, we'll do a Q and A over the next couple of days at the end of each part of the presentation. But go ahead and guess in chat. Let me know if you know the answer to this. Now, we're going to shift gears. We're going to talk about the war in the Pacific with Imperial Japan. What is the official bureaucratic name of Imperial Japan? Okay, and I will take a couple off the board so you don't have to worry about it. It's not the land of the rising sun. I'm not looking for Imperial Japan. Okay, I'm looking for that formal bureaucratic name. You're not allowed to go online and like look at Wikipedia to find it out. Okay, and so we have Nippon. That is always a guess, not correct, but Kevin, who guessed first, still gets 5 non-redeemable bonus points. And so, well done, Kevin. There. If so, even if you get it wrong, you get points. If you get it right, you get 10 of those non-redeemable bonus points. So go ahead, have fun in chat. All right, here we go. So we have. We'll see if anybody can get that. I've only had a couple of people get that correct, and you might be surprised to hear what it is in just a few more minutes. So we'll get back to that. So December 7th, 1941, the same time as the Battle of Moscow, Imperial Japan attacks the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Now, your question here, oh, I think I saw somebody get it right there in chat. I will go back and look in just a moment. But your question here should be, why? Why on earth would Imperial Japan attack the United States? And of course, when we think about Japan today, I think of a very long-standing ally in a pretty dangerous portion of the world, right? A very peaceful country, a country in Japan that has a significant military, but one that is totally configured for defensive purposes. I certainly don't think of them attacking the United States. And some of you have mentioned oil there, and oil is going to play into our story in a major way here in just a moment. Now, I want to see, I thought that, as I mentioned, I think somebody got our trivia question right here. Our first one. We'll see if I come up with other ones. I got to go back and look. Oh, and so Nathaniel is close. And going back up, Zachary got it. And so anyway, I'm going to give Dylan, or who was it? Or Dylan, or what do we got here? I want to make sure that we get the points correctly doled out here. So Nathaniel, we're going to give you 7.5 points for that because you were close. And Zachary's got it. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. What a name. And it sounds like a great place. Wouldn't you like to live in any co-prosperity sphere? Sounds awesome, but let me assure you, it was not. Okay, so the propaganda was that the Japanese were basically coming to liberate all of the people of Asia from Western colonialism. They were going to liberate those countries from Western colonialism, but instead in place a much more brutal system in its place. And again, we'll have some numbers that will actually quantify that a little bit at the end of the presentation tomorrow. You can ask me if you want to go ahead and find out today when we do Q&A in just a little while. But let's go back to that question. Why on earth would Japan attack the United States at Pearl Harbor? To answer this question, and again, you're going to get this largely from the American perspective. You can ask me what the Japanese perspective on this would be, because the Japanese, in short, viewed this as a war of survival. Okay? We don't exactly see it the same way here in the United States, but again, there is more to that. Let's go back to 1904, 1905. 1904, 1905, the Japanese successfully fight a war with Imperial Russia. They sink the Pacific fleet of the Russians. They sink the Russian Baltic fleet, which had sailed all the way out to the Pacific. And so anyway, these victories over Imperial Russia emboldened Japan to expand onto continental Asia. The first target is going to be 1905 Korea. Okay, they invade and take Korea in 1905, formally annex Korea into the empire in 1910. Now, remember, I told you we jump around in time. I want to jump to 1945 to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Did you know that thousands of Koreans died in each of those attacks? Now, why were there Koreans there? Well, for 40 years, their entire country had been turned into a big forced labor camp, and Koreans were in both of those cities and other cities in southern Japan, fortifying them for what was believed to be an imminent invasion. Now, we'll talk about what actually happened later, but do keep that in mind from the Korean perspective. And I can assure you that people in Korea, whether it's in North Korea or South Korea, this is history that they have not forgotten and probably won't soon forget. But anyway, as you can see on our map there, Japan is going to years later invade and take the whole of Manchuria. They're going to take strategic portions of coastal China as well. And what's finally going to force the issue with the United States and get to the oil that all of you have been talking about there in chat is when they invade Southeast Asia. So you can see all of the countries there, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, etc. All of those countries back then were collectively known as French Indochina. So these are French colonies, okay? France has been knocked out of the war, and so Japan decides to put these colonies under new management, and in they go. And the United States finally, at this point in time, decides to impose some pretty significant sanctions on Imperial Japan. Now, we have been fierce economic rivals with the Japanese for decades at this point, a part of the story that is often forgotten. Uh, we impose these sanctions for two reasons. First of all, again, economic uh, adversaries, if you will, economic rivals with the Japanese. It was our hope to manufacture cheap trinkets here in the United States and to sell them to all of these customers in Asia and make a lot of money. Well, Japan, when the Japanese are taking over all of these potential customers and either enslaving them, killing them, or at least making their life very uncomfortable, that's not good for the bottom line. And so we don't like that. And so we finally decided to draw a line in the sand. The other reason that the United States does not like this is that, as I alluded to earlier, this is going to be an exceptionally brutal expansion of the Japanese empire. And I'll put it to you like this for now. Because the numbers are so spotty, I don't know where they fall, but Imperial Japan may well have outmurdered Nazi Germany. Now, think about that for a moment. Again, the numbers are spotty. We'll talk about what the Chinese would claim today, how many of their people alone were killed by the Japanese back then. But this was one of the most murderous regimes in modern history, okay? And things are just getting started at this point in time. And so we're not very happy with the nature of the occupation. There is a humanitarian crisis that is unfolding under Japanese rule that again, we think we had better do something about that. So we impose sanctions. And as I mentioned, these were serious sanctions. Japan itself is not a resource-rich nation, and so it relies on raw materials to come in from other places. And so at that point in time, this may surprise you as well, the United States was the world's leading exporter of oil. We sold more oil than any other single country in the world, and Japan was one of our very good customers. We also sent them important war-making ingredients such as scrap metal. And so they would take American oil, scrap metal, and turn them into tanks and planes and battleships and different things like that to go out and expand the borders of the co-prosperity sphere. Now, the Japanese need to make a decision. We had hoped that the sanctions would provoke the Japanese to apologize and go home. And that's not what happened. Instead, the Japanese decide to put an end to the rivalry in the Pacific. They want to own the Pacific. Now, I'm going to give you the basic plan, and this is based on the prevailing view in Japan at the time. Not everybody in Japan felt this way, but the prevailing view was, look, the Americans, they, yeah, no, I don't, I saw in chat there, I don't think anybody was really expecting them to apologize and go home. That was more of like the hope, but it's not going to happen as we're going to see here. But anyway, uh, the prevailing view in Japan was, look, the Americans don't want to fight. They didn't help their friends, the British or the French. If we invade Indonesia and take oil from Indonesia instead, the Americans will not want to fight us. They don't have the economy to fight. They're still suffering from the Great Depression, and so they're not prepared to do that. But just to make sure that they don't fight us, we'll attack the fleet at Pacific Harbor. We'll destroy it, and they won't even have an offensive strike capability after that. We'll invade the Philippines at the same time. And so that is where the attack on Pearl Harbor comes from. Again, from the Japanese perspective, this is a war of survival, and it turns out to be, and they lose, as we're going to see in the end. But anyway, Pearl Harbor is attacked on the 7th. And remember, what is the objective of this attack? Is it simply to sink the Pacific Fleet? Is it simply to kill a couple thousand Americans? No, the Japanese want a strategic victory. They want the war to begin and end at Pearl Harbor. They want to own the Pacific within a few weeks of this attack. And that's not going to happen. If we are going to summarize the entire Pacific War as it's going to transpire in one sentence, you have that in the middle of your screen right now. Admiral Hara Tadaichi was one of the architects of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And as you can see there, he said, "We won a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor and thereby lost the war." Well, again, they won a strategic victory. Instead, they win a pretty bold, pretty innovative tactical victory at Pearl Harbor. But they're going to get pulled into a long, protracted war that they're not ready for and that they were not counting on, just like the Germans. Okay, so right now things may look kind of good for the Germans and the Japanese, but they're already in over their heads. And I would argue, at least, that from this point forward, the Japanese have no real way to win World War II. And it's only going to get worse and worse with every day that's going to pass from this point forward. Now, of course, the United States declares war on Japan in response to this. Germany was allied with Imperial Japan during World War II, as you all probably know. And so the Germans declare war on the United States on December the 11th. Italy did as well. And so now the whole world, just about, or many, many countries within it, are now at war, including all of the great powers in the world at that point in time. Let's finally talk about some science stuff, which is probably why you're at the lab and why you tuned in today. So let's do talk about this a little bit. And I should let you know as well, our goal today is to get to the end of 1942, okay, with the first breakthrough of the Manhattan Project. We're not even going to get to the construction of Los Alamos. That'll be one of the first things that we do tomorrow. But anyway, for today, I don't think we will. Anyway, we'll find out. I mean, I never know how these are going to go, and as long as some of you are still here, I can't tell how many are here right now, but hopefully at least a few of you. I can see the chat popping up. Go back in time to 1938, and let's shift gears again to thinking about Nazi Germany. By late 1938, Hitler has fully consolidated his power. He has illegally rebuilt the German armed forces at this point at 300. Man, Michael just told me there are 300 of you. Now I'm nervous all of a sudden. I'm trying not to mess this up. But fission is first produced in Nazi Germany in 1938. And again, here I would argue that no country was better poised to build a nuclear weapon in 1938 than Hitler's Germany. And that ties back into our original question. Can you imagine the world if Hitler had a nuclear monopoly, right? Well, they produced fission first. So let's talk about why Germany's ideally poised to build a nuclear weapon. As many of you probably know, fortunately, the Germans chased away a lot of really good scientists. May not have felt fortunate at the time, but many of them would come to the United Kingdom. Many of them would come here to the United States. Some would be involved here at Los Alamos with the Manhattan Project work. Fortunate for civilization, unfortunate for the Germans. They did lose out on some real scientific talent. But anyway, they still have a lot of bright people there. Germany had been a center of physics, chemistry, metallurgy, on down the list for decades and decades. They had that pedigree in many scientific and engineering fields. They also had all the uranium ore that you would need to get a weapons program moving and to keep it fueled. A lot of times people will ask me, why weren't they successful then? And you can ask me that in chat if you want, and we'll talk about that either today or tomorrow, and I'll tell you what little I know on that subject. But anyway, that's why I think that they were better poised than any other country at that point in time. They had all of the basic ingredients there just waiting to be assembled. Now, by the way, much easier said than done. Let's talk about fission. So why is fission a big deal? Well, in fission, you split the nucleus of an atom, it releases some energy, okay? Now, let's say that you could get a chain reaction splitting the nuclei of many atoms. Let's say you get a chain reaction going. You might be able to release a lot of energy. And what is that starting to sound like? Well, maybe a weapon, maybe some kind of bomb. Now, scientists had been thinking about the possibility of harnessing this new process or this process into a weapon for many years, long before fission had been discovered. One of them was named Leo Szilard. He was a Hungarian. We're going to talk about him on the next slide. But now fission has been demonstrated. It was interpreted as fission very, very early the next year in 1939 by Lisa Meitner and Otto Frisch. Frisch is going to factor into our story later. He will arrive here at Los Alamos as well. But anyway, this is a potentially a big deal, again, if you can harness this in the power of a weapon. So let's go back and talk about Leo Szilard for a moment. If you've never heard of Leo before, don't feel bad. He's an important part of our story, but nobody knew who he was back then. And kind of unfortunately, I guess, people are kind of forgetting who Leo was now as well. And I think one of the reasons why is that a lot of times when people give this history, they tend to play up Einstein's contribution, and you don't even hear about Leo. Maybe you've heard this part of the story before. Albert Einstein recognizes the great peril of the situation, sends a letter to President Roosevelt warning him about the Germans, and the Manhattan Project is born. And that's not really what happened. That's kind of what happened. Okay, well, what do I mean by that? It was Szilard who had been thinking about turning fission into a weapon for many years. I believe that he had even taken out a patent or two on the idea in the United Kingdom. He does want to let the president know about what's going on, but he's got that problem. He's Leo Szilard, and if he sends a letter to the president, nobody's going to read it. No one's going to care. So how can we fix this problem? Well, he goes to his friend Albert Einstein, and I like to paraphrase my quotes and conversations, as you will probably, hopefully, be obviously, or it will be obvious to you. But anyway, he says, Al, look, we should probably warn the president. If you wrote, if we wrote a letter together and you signed it and sent it, somebody in the White House might actually read it. And so anyway, they write the letter together. You can see a picture of them in a one down there at the bottom of the screen. That is a 100% accurate historical reconstruction after the war was over. And so they penned this letter. It's about a page and a half long. I don't have the second page on here, but it's easy to find online, or I can send you a copy. All of you know my email address because it's in the phone book, right? Pretty easy, abcar@atlanta.gov. If you have questions, corrections, if you would like to see my source material for any of this stuff, don't hesitate to reach out and send me an email. And you will get a response. It may not be immediate. I stay pretty busy, but I do get back to all of the emails that are sent my way. Now, this letter is sent about a month before World War II breaks out in Europe. So this is before the invasion of Poland, okay? And this letter does not start the Manhattan Project. Now, perhaps this could be described as the conception of the Manhattan Project. It's going to grow over time, but this is not the beginning of the Manhattan Project. In fact, I think there is an argument to be made that this letter may have even delayed the Manhattan Project. Well, how on earth could it delay the Manhattan Project? Well, you see where I've got the arrow pointing on the screen there. Hopefully you can all see the slides right now. Let's read the sentence at the bottom of the first page together. A single bomb of this type carried by boat and exploded in a port might very well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory. Now, does that sound like a good weapon to you? Doesn't really sound like a very good weapon to me. I mean, when you think about the end of World War II, we're talking about, relatively small weapons that can be put on a plane and delivered by a plane in combat. Here we're talking about a big, slow-moving boat with a lot of uranium on it. And that's not a very good weapon. And you might be thinking, well, that sounds like an awful lot of firepower there, though, destroying the port and much of the surrounding area. Well, guess what? That had already kind of been done before. I bet you all remember the Beirut explosion from about this time last year, right? Everybody remember Beirut? What was it? I forget the approximate yield of that. I think it was like close to 2 kilotons or something like that. Very substantial explosion there in Beirut. Well, back in 1917, there was a similar explosion in the small Canadian port of Halifax. And so hopefully you could see the picture of Halifax there, or what's left of it on the bottom left-hand portion of the screen. Back in 1917, the Great War was raging in Europe. And so Canada, there was a small but important port there, Halifax in Canada, fully laden ammunition ship that was ready to take supplies to the Western Front. Collides with another ship in the port, starts a fire aboard the ammunition ship. It burns for 10 or 20 minutes and ignites the main cargo. When the main cargo ignites, it releases nearly 3 kilotons of energy on the port. And you can see the aftermath there in the pictures. So what happened? When that ship exploded, it destroyed the port along with much of the surrounding territory. And so Einstein and Szilard are not describing the future. They've described an accident that had happened over 20 years earlier. And I think that's one of the main reasons why the United States was not focused on building nuclear weapons in the early years of World War II. Because why would you take a lot of your best and brightest people and try and figure out a far more complicated, less certain, and more expensive way of doing something that had been done on accident over 20 years earlier? So in the United States, we're not focused on building nuclear weapons at this point in time. However, if you could harness fission in a reactor and produce electricity, now that sounds like a good idea. And so that is going to be the focus in the United States early on. This letter is read at the White House. As a result, there is a committee that's put together and given a full $6,000 to start looking at how basically what potential there is with fission. But the focus is not on bombs at this point in time. So our next question is, well, how did our focus get on bombs then? How did we make the transition from reactors to bombs? Well, we're going to have some more international help. Remember, Einstein and Szilard are not only foreign-born scientists, but they're from Axis countries. You have Einstein, who was born in Germany. You have Szilard, who was Hungarian. Hungary was allied with Nazi Germany during World War II. And isn't it interesting that they came together to kind of give us a little bit of a push to get things started? Same thing happened in the United Kingdom. You had two Axis-born scientists. One was Otto Frisch. He was Austrian. We already met Otto a few slides ago. The other was Rudolf Peierls, a German. And so Peierls and Frisch, they fled to the United Kingdom. They send a letter to the British government saying, hey, we think that you can make a super bomb out of this fission business, and the Germans could be way ahead of you. Now, two things are different in this case. For one, they're talking about a super bomb. We're not talking about a big boat full of uranium rocks and things like that that looks more like the Halifax explosion. We're talking about a real deliverable, world-changing, futuristic nuclear weapon, a super bomb. The other thing that is different is that the United Kingdom is now at war. The United States in 1940 is still not at war, not going to be basically for the whole of 1941 as well. And so anyway, the British government gets this letter. It's known as the Frisch-Peierls memo, which I'm sure is very surprising to you. And they sponsor a feasibility study. Can one of these actually be made? And if it can be made, how long will it take to produce one? Are we talking about years, or are we talking about decades and centuries? And so anyway, the committee that's put together is given the name MOD. Some interesting stories about why we think it may be called the MOD committee. You can ask me about that in Q&A if you would like. But anyway, the MOD committee completes its report in July of 1941, just a few weeks after the Soviet Union has been invaded by Nazi Germany. Now, before we get to the MOD committee findings, let's talk about the invasion one more time. What do you think the reaction was back in London? Do you think that they were excited when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union? You think they thought, oh, hey, the Soviets are on our side now. We're going to win. That wasn't the reaction in London. The reaction was more approximately, wow, those guys signed a deal with the devil and the devil stabbed them in the back. We're shocked. And oh, yeah, they're not going to last more than 2 or 3 months anyway. Not very much excitement going on there. The British thought, what's really going to save us is if we can get the Americans involved. And because every other country in the world, I think, all the main players at least, no one saw the potential of the United States except for the United Kingdom. Uh, Going back to the Mod Committee report predicts that if everything goes just right, you might have the material for bomb number one by the end of 1943. So this is important because not only do we have a futuristic weapon, a truly transformative weapon, but it's actually within reach. It's only a couple of years into the future and maybe not even that. Now, how does that relate to getting the United States involved in the war? Well, the British thought, we'll send a top secret mission to the United States. They'll take copies of all of our top secret reports, including a copy of the Mod Committee report, and share it with the Americans. If they see how much progress we've made in making atomic weapons, maybe they'll realize that the Germans, who produced fission first, they could even be further ahead. They could have an atomic bomb tomorrow. And maybe the Americans will finally want to do something about it and get involved in the war and try and defeat the Germans before they can do something like that. So that is the reasoning behind this. So sure enough, the special mission comes to the United States in the fall of 1941. They bring copies of the Mod Committee report. That copy of the Mod Committee report sits in a safe, locked up for many weeks until the end of the year. Kind of mid-late November, Vannevar Bush gets a copy of it. Some of you may have heard of Vannevar Bush before. He's an important player in what will become the Manhattan Project. We're still not there yet. He's in charge of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, the OSRD, and they're the ones who have been tasked at looking at reactors with a little bit of bomb work on the side. Other American scientists have known what the Brits have been doing. We had American scientists who were in Britain as the Mod Committee was investigating fission. But Bush is the first senior policymaker to both see a copy of this report and do something about it. This begins to shift American thinking away from reactors and more toward bombs in a meaningful way for the very first time. But then we're going to have a massive distraction just a couple weeks later, thereabouts. Pearl Harbor. The Japanese are going to attack Pearl Harbor. And so, just as we're starting to think about atomic bombs, the nation is now finally at war. And of course, after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, after the Italians and the Germans declared war on the United States, in the opening months of 1942, job one is just to stabilize the situation because things are in terrible shape. 1942 was an awful year for the Allies. What do we do? How do we respond to the Japanese, especially with much of the Pacific Fleet destroyed, sunk, or at least heavily damaged? Fortunately, the aircraft carriers were out at sea. Maybe some of these ships can be repaired and put back into service, but what are we going to do? How are we going to respond to the Germans? These are the priorities of the early 1942, but scientists are getting together and talking about bombs more and more and more. The climax of this early discussion of weapons design comes in the summer of 1942 at Berkeley. And so we're going to have scientists engaging in a top secret conference, the 1942 Berkeley Summer Conference,
Yeah,
at a
I
public
got out of
university.
that meeting actually at 1:30.
Oh, I heard somebody unmuted there. Was that a comment for me or somebody else? I guess I'll just keep going
I think
on
that was
here.
a mute problem, Alan. You can go ahead and go.
Oh, okay. Just wanted to make sure. Okay, so we were at the Berkeley conference, Berkeley Summer Conference. Scientists are going to get together, including one J. Robert Oppenheimer, who we'll talk quite a bit more about soon. But they're going to start talking about actual weapons designs now. So things are getting more serious. But perhaps you can see the problem here. Should we really be having top secret conferences at public universities for one thing? Maybe we should shift that somewhere else. The other thing is scientists are really great at a lot of things, but a lot of experience doing big national construction projects. Maybe not. Maybe we need to bring in some help from the federal government. And who within the federal government, what entity has lots of experience with big construction projects? How about the Army, specifically the Army Corps of Engineers? And so now we get to August of 1942. The Army Corps of Engineers is given this task. The order to create the Manhattan Project, I believe, was, I never can remember this for some reason, somebody will put it in chat, but I think that the order formally establishing the Manhattan Project was issued August 13th, I think, and it went into effect a few days later. Again, you'll correct me in chat there, and I appreciate that. But anyway, the Manhattan Project is finally born, and it gets its name because the Corps of Engineers had some office space available in, you guessed it, Manhattan. And so we're going to name headquarters after, we're going to name our headquarters, or the project after our headquarters. Maybe not the best idea from a security standpoint, but that was kind of common procedure and remains so for the Army Corps of Engineers. We're going to name the headquarters, we're going to name the project after the geographical location of the headquarters. So that's how the Manhattan Project comes into existence and where it gets its name. Now, we need a really good, dynamic, experienced, highly educated leader for this. And the person who we're going to end up with is Colonel Leslie Groves. And you can see Colonel Groves over there on the right side of the screen. Now, Colonel Groves is given the job because he was a highly educated engineer. He was very experienced. In fact, he had built the Pentagon in roughly 18 months, 18 months actual construction time on the Pentagon. And I believe, again, correct me in chat, that the Pentagon was the largest building ever constructed under one roof at that point in time. And so those are, that looks pretty good on the resume. So let's get Colonel Groves to come in here and be a part of the project. And so anyway, do you think he's excited about that? Would you be excited about that? You're a career military officer. World War II is broken out a few months earlier. What do you want? Do you want a science fair project for an assignment, or do you want to go out and fight? And so anyway, General Groves wanted a field assignment, but he gets stuck with us instead. He accepts his orders, as good soldiers do, but he also starts trying to negotiate for some things that are going to help him. The first thing he says is, "Now look," again, paraphrasing, "you told me during the briefing that if I was successful, this new technology could win the war, and you're going to entrust that kind of responsibility to a colonel?" Hint, hint. And so if you see that picture of now General Groves on the screen, the general is going to get the first star there on his collar in September of 1942. So he is promoted to general. Second thing he does is, now remember, during World War II, everything was rationed in the United States. Any material rationed. You had to prove why you needed it. There was a pecking order for getting stuff. The Manhattan Project had no priority to get anything. And so General Groves, again, negotiates here, and he gets the top priority. Any material, any person, anything he needs to get this important job done, he's got first pick. He gets to pick what he wants before any other project in the country. And so that's quite a leap. And finally, and probably most impressively to you and me, he gets an unlimited charge code. He gets all the money he needs. They tell him, you don't worry about money. We'll take care of the money. So we've got a highly motivated general with top priority, with unlimited money, and things are going to start happening very quickly. Another thing I should mention is that General Groves was kind of known for being gruff. He could be, he could be kind of rough. He knew how to get the job done, but he was not, and he was not opposed to getting out the bulldozer and just mowing down resistance. So he did make some enemies along the way, I should say. He was not very popular at Los Alamos during World War II, for instance, because he was just this, stupid general who was angry and just holding everything up. But anyway, I think his reputation has changed over time. I should mention though, he was very specific about this. His name was Leslie Richard Groves, but he strongly preferred to be called Dick. Apparently, no one at Los Alamos had a problem complying with that order. So let's keep things moving, right, and talk about maybe we will get to building Los Alamos today because we still have 10 minutes left. I did get a laugh there. Please don't report me to HR. But I want to strongly emphasize here that the Manhattan Project was a national project, okay? And really even international as well. Consider how many people from different countries, even Axis countries, came together in the United Kingdom and in the United States ultimately to work on this and make it a success. Pretty good map, I would say here. I think this is from DOE that we have on the screen right now, which points out many of the locations of the Manhattan Project. There were others as well that didn't even make this map, but this is most of the sites, including the big three that we're going to talk about for our quick World War II talk today and tomorrow. So these are going to be Hanford, which you can see up there in Washington State, the Hanford Engineer Works. Los Alamos, which we'll get to in just a little while. We'll close out maybe with a discussion of Los Alamos today. And finally, Oak Ridge, Y12. We're going to talk about what each of these big sites did and why they were important on our next few slides. So let's breeze through these very quickly. So first of all, the Clinton Engineering Works. We'll start with Oak Ridge since we wrapped up there just a moment ago. Also known as Site X, Y12, Oak Ridge, Clinton Engineer Works, but Clinton Engineer Works is going to be our formal name for today. We're going to, the basic job here is going to be to enrich uranium, but there are going to be other capabilities at Oak Ridge as well, okay? We could set up shop in Eastern Tennessee. Why? Well, the main reason is that back during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, one of the public works programs resulted in the Tennessee Valley Authority. Have you heard of the TVA? And I'm not talking about the one in Loki, if you're like watching that on Disney Plus. This is the original TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. So many hydroelectric dams were built along the rivers of Tennessee. The idea was to produce a lot of electricity, to bring electricity to rural America. Instead, we're going to bring electricity to the Manhattan Project instead. And also, speaking of rural America, Eastern Tennessee, there are not too many people there, sparsely populated. We don't want to have to evict too many people. We've got plenty of electricity. Looks like a good place to me. And so that is those are the main reasons that we're going to put Oak Ridge out there. Pretty big places. You can see they got 59,000 acres. Los Alamos is going to be even larger, but pretty big place here and lots of construction going on. Now, I didn't mention it on the last screen. I should have, but maybe you read it. It's been estimated that 500,000 people worked for the Manhattan Project at one point or another during its existence. 500,000 people. Most of them were not physicists or chemists or scientists like that. Most of them were construction workers. We never talk about the construction workers, but the construction workers are our unsung heroes of the Manhattan Project. There's no Oak Ridge, there's no Hanford, there's Los Alamos, and all of a sudden they're going to exist in a matter of months. So thank you, construction workers. And by the way, really not a good place to work, that Manhattan Project, for construction workers. So there was an incredibly high attrition figure for workers there. But anyway, now we're very appreciative of your efforts, or if there are any left out there. Now at Oak Ridge, we're going to talk about two things really quickly here. The first is if you look at the top left-hand portion of the screen, that is a reactor. Okay, so we're going to talk about the world's first nuclear reactor in just a moment. That'll be where we close out today, I hope, if we have enough time. Maybe we will just get to Los Alamos, we'll see. First reactor, by the way, is at the University of Chicago, but we'll tell that story momentarily. We're going to take the world's first reactor and we're going to make a prototype of it for making plutonium. And that prototype is going to be known as the X-10 reactor. It is going to be built at Oak Ridge there. Don't let this confuse you. Making plutonium was not the main thing that was being done at Oak Ridge. That's going to be out at Hanford. But they did have that capability. They had the X-10 reactor there. And I like to point this out also because you can go visit it. The X-10 reactor is still there today. It looks just like it does in the picture there, except those two guys holding the rod there are now mannequins, and you can now experience X-10 in living color. And so be sure and visit X-10 if you make it out to Tennessee. It's certainly worth stopping by. The bottom picture is where a lot of the action is going to go down at Oak Ridge. That's the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant. And guess what? It's the new largest building under one roof at that point in time. So not bad. General Grove's there. So two of the largest buildings ever constructed. But I want you to think about this for a moment. This is just one side of the Manhattan Project. And at this one site, K-25 is just one building there. And so the scale of the Manhattan Project, again, this was not Albert Einstein and Oppenheimer in somebody's garage just slapping this together. It was a huge national effort. And by the way, if you're waiting to see what Einstein does, he's already out. He signed a letter. That's kind of the end of his job. So for Einstein fans out there, not a lot more about him in the talk today or tomorrow, but you should stay tuned anyway. So let's talk about what's happening at Hanford, also known as Site W. So we're going to select Hanford site in eastern Washington. Again, it's sparsely populated, and we have the Columbia River there. Now, why do we need a river? Well, if we're going to make several nuclear reactors to produce plutonium, we're going to need something to keep them cool, and the Columbia River can do that. 25,000 plus gallons of water per minute just to do that job. And again, not going to have to evict too many people. This is going to be the ideal solution for our job. I had somebody last time I gave this talk mention that is a relatively modern photo there on the top right, and I should replace it because it's an anachronism. And I guess that they are right, so I'll get that replaced. But I'm an anachronism, and that I guess keeps me company. So we'll keep it there for now. But anyway, this is what we are going to be doing at Hanford. So remember, in a moment, first nuclear reactor at the University of Chicago. X10 is going to be our practice prototype production reactor at Oak Ridge, but it's at Hanford where we're going to duplicate these reactors several times over in order to make plutonium, okay? And we finally get to Los Alamos with like 4 minutes to go today. And by the way, I'm going to stick around for Q&A. It's not like it's 2:30, got to bail. I will stick around. And if we don't get to, I think Michael's going to help us do Q&A today and tomorrow. If there are like a lot of questions and comments and corrections and things like that, and we can't get to everything, remember, you can send me that email too, and I will eventually respond. Okay? And if I don't for some reason, then send me a reminder. Those gentle reminders are very helpful to me. So we need a place where all the work can come together. Because we've talked about materials production, enriching uranium, making plutonium, but who's going to take this material and design it in the form of a bomb? Who's going to design the bomb? Who's going to build a bomb? Who is going to test a bomb? Who's going to figure out how to put a bomb into combat? We need a weapons design laboratory. Long before, months before the actual location of the weapons design laboratory was chosen, the director was chosen. And there he is on the screen. We all love him, right? J. Robert Oppenheimer. We've got a couple of statues of him in town, so bravo. Bravo there for our friend Bob, our hero. Why is he selected? Well, he was introduced to General Groves. And by the way, there's a really good book that I recommend, and I recommend this because it is in fact very good. Also written by my friend Jim Konetka, called The General and the Genius. So if you want to explore this partnership more, look at The General and the Genius. Do let me make sure that I make this clear, though. General Groves is the boss. Yes, they're partners in this, but Oppenheimer is the subordinate. General Groves is in charge of that whole map that we saw earlier. Oppenheimer is in charge just of Los Alamos. Now, of course, as we know, disproportionately important dot on the map there, but anyway, Oppenheimer is just in charge of that part of it. These two guys were introduced, and they were just about as different as you can be. I mean, in background, political persuasion, demeanor, go on down the list. They're kind of opposites. And guess what? They really, really thoroughly impress each other. I think that Oppenheimer really wanted the job of being director, and I think that he was ambitious and he saw an opportunity. And I think that Groves saw some incredible potential in Oppenheimer just waiting to be unlocked. And so, anyway, these guys, despite their differences, really form a great relationship and partnership. I'd stop short of saying that they were friends, but I do think that they had tremendous respect, admiration for each other, and that lasted for the rest of their lives. So anyway, Oppenheimer is selected. Now, why would we want Oppenheimer to be in charge? A, he is pretty bright. He is considered by many to be America's leading theoretical physicist at this point in time. He has produced publications on the possible existence of black holes in the mid 30s already, and so he's really smart. We like that. He's also available. You know, there were Americans who had won Nobel Prizes. I believe Oppenheimer was twice nominated, but never won the prize. We do have Americans who had won, like Arthur Compton, Carl David Anderson, uh, uh, Ernest Lawrence. Lawrence and Compton are already involved in the Manhattan Project. Carl Anderson was a very strong candidate to be the director of Los Alamos, but he had some other issues come up. And if you don't know that story, my colleague John Moore wrote a story about it for Lanel Today, I think a little over a year ago, and you can look that up online. But anyway, Oppenheimer gets the job. Now, we would not want Oppenheimer, and I know Michael. Let me ask Michael. Michael, can we go on for a few minutes? Would that like really ruffle somebody's feathers?
Oh, no, I don't think that would be a problem at all, Alan.
Sounds good. Let's go on for 5 minutes, and then we'll do Q&A then. So we'll wrap up Los Alamos here. Reasons you would not want Oppenheimer to be your director. Well, first of all, he's never managed anything before. How would you feel if you were named the director of the laboratory? Now, you might think, hey, great, I'll get a big office and a beautiful view and a nice paycheck. And guess what? It gets really hard after that. And, how would you like to have to make important decisions that affect thousands of people having had acquired no management experience? Well, that was where Oppenheimer was. Of course, in the early days, we thought that the project was going to be much, much smaller than it turned out to be, but no management experience, that's one thing. The other thing is he was seen as a pretty significant security risk. Now, back during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, communism was nearly mainstream, maybe even mainstream in this country, certainly in parts of it. Well, why? Well, communism sounds like a good idea if you're starving, if you're waiting in a line at a soup kitchen, if you don't know where your next meal is coming from. Now, keep in mind, this is back when the Soviet Union was a closed society. What you heard coming out of that country was everybody here is free and equal and has a job and a place to live and an important role to play in the greater collective. Well, that sounds like a pretty good deal if I can't feed my child. Maybe it does to you too. And so communism was pretty popular. Now, with Oppenheimer, he never formally joined the party, but he met a girl named Jean, and Jean was a member of the Communist Party and turns out to be the first great love of his life. And so he starts going to communist meetings with Jean. He contributes to communist friendly organizations. His eventual wife, Kitty Oppenheimer, is a member of the Communist Party. Oppenheimer's brother, Frank, member of the Communist Party. Frank's wife, Oppenheimer's sister in law, Jackie, member of the Communist Party. Well, when the Soviet Union helped Hitler start World War II, a lot of people, seeing that the Soviet Union was in fact just an expansionistic, murderous state that would even deal with Hitler to some degree, a lot of people, most people perhaps, most adherents backed away from the cause, including Oppenheimer. But now he's going to be the director of Los Alamos, and we're going to have to do that whole background check thing. And as it turns out, when all of your friends and all your references are communists, that really does not help with the clearance process. And they did not want to give Oppenheimer a clearance. But General Groves overruled security. They gave Oppenheimer a clearance, and they did watch him throughout his employment as the director and beyond as well. For instance, Oppenheimer, when he was the director here during World War II, he was not allowed to leave town without an armed guard to keep him safe and to keep an eye on him as well. And so Oppenheimer was watched at all times. So that's an issue. But again, we're bringing him in. He's going to be the director of the laboratory, and we're going to do some really cool stuff here. The final thing on Los Alamos, our last topic today, is how did we end up here? Well, the Manhattan Project realized, even before Oppenheimer was officially on board, that northern New Mexico might be a good place for the weapons laboratory. Why? First of all, it's far inland. We don't want the enemy to launch some kind of bombing raid from a special ship or something like that, or long distance airplane that could, where they could bomb our weapons laboratory. Let's make that plane go a long way. Let's make those saboteurs hike a long way to get there. So far inland, isolated. There are no, even today, no direct flights to Los Alamos, right? So it's isolated, sparsely populated. There was not much up here before the laboratory came to town. There was the School for Boys. Most of you know about the Los Alamos Ranch School that was centered on Bathtub Row and Fuller Lodge here in town. If you don't, there's a great museum next door to Fuller Lodge. Go check it out. I'm sure that they would like guests now. Or I think they would. Anyway, go check it out. Try to check it out. And beyond that, there were some homesteaders in the area, families that had homesteaded portions of the land up here, but that was it. So you're looking at evicting maybe a couple of hundred people, not a couple thousand. If you are interested, by the way, in the homesteaders, the laboratory has published a photo book on that subject, and I think I can get you a PDF if you would like to see it. But anyway, before we get to Los Alamos itself, northern New Mexico looks like a pretty good place to set up shop. And so Oppenheimer, Groves, others, they come to Albuquerque, then they go to Jimenez Springs. Jimenez Springs was the first choice, but they decide that it's not defensible enough. For those of you who've made the drive there, it's about 45 miles west of Los Alamos. Beautiful drive, all seasons. but it kind of sits in a bowl. And so they did not like that. And so Oppenheimer, as it turns out, very familiar with northern New Mexico. In fact, it's been said that his two great loves were, by him, I think it's been said, his two great loves were physics and our state. He had a cabin near Santa Fe, and he came to know this area well. And as I mentioned, he loved it. So he was familiar. He knew about Los Alamos and suggested it. So they make the drive over the mountain. They come to Los Alamos and decide this is where we're going to set up shop. There's just enough infrastructure from the boys' school and the homesteads. And again, they thought, maybe it'll be Oppenheimer and 100 scientists and then support staff will get the job done. Well, it's going to grow quite a bit, as you can see there on the screen. We had, I believe, about 1,700 technical staff members during the war, and hundreds of people who were doing other types of work here as well. Ultimately, we had between, I think, 6,000 and 8,000 people in the Los Alamos area by the war. The town grew astronomically very quickly, and Oppenheimer grew as a manager under the tutelage of General Groves at this same time. And so now we've got our three main sites set up. You've met Oppenheimer, you know General Groves. Tomorrow we'll talk about what happens next. This is where we're going to start by talking about the first controlled nuclear chain reaction, Enrico Fermi there, who you see on the screen. But for today, let's stop right there. I will stop sharing and we will transition back over to Michael and do a little bit of Q&A and corrections. Hopefully there weren't too many of those.
Excellent. Thank you for a very interesting talk, Alan, and we look forward to the continuation for tomorrow. So I'll try to introduce some of the questions to you, Alan, but they're probably going to be a lot. So if you see anything on the chat as well, you can feel free to answer those questions. We'll kind of leave it a little open-ended. One thing I'd like to ask, since we have some participants that may be dropping off, is Kelly, can you re-chat the link for people to view this talk online again before people leave? So there was a couple of questions right before you got to the end, Alan, that were related to some of the stuff that you talked about earlier. So one is, why didn't Einstein work for the project, assuming Manhattan Project? And then also the origin of the British MAUD acronym.
Okay, well, let me start with the British MAUD acronym first. There is an interesting story there. And again, since we've got a lot of questions, if we don't get to your question, your comment, your correction today, just send me the email and I will. But going to MAUD committee, there are two stories that are behind that, which are completely different. On the one hand, the one that's straightforward and maybe a little bit more boring is that it is an acronym that stands for military, what was it? Military application of uranium detonation, right? I mean, it's an acronym. Acronyms are boring. But that is one story that is put forward. And I'm not so sure that that one is correct. I can think that the more interesting story may actually be correct. And I have talked with my counterpart at the Atomic Weapons Establishment in the United Kingdom about this. He's always tried to track down some definitive documentation pertaining to this, but we haven't yet. The other story pertains to Niels Bohr. And so many of you hopefully know the name Niels Bohr, one of the great physicists of the 20th century. Bohr was Danish, okay, and he continued to live in Denmark well after World War II started. I forget the exact year that he finally left, but when the Germans invaded Denmark, you'll remember that early on in the presentation, the fight in Denmark lasted like an hour. I mean, it literally, I think, lasted like an hour. A few people were killed, and that was kind of it for Denmark, very peaceful nation. The German occupation of Denmark was essentially non-existent for a couple of years. Later into the war, the Germans decide to really occupy Denmark at that point in time. This is also as you'll remember. I mean, the Germans don't like a lot of, or the Nazis. Let me clarify. The Nazis don't like a lot of different groups. One of those groups, of course, the most well-known, are the Jews. And guess what? Niels Bohr is considered a Jew. And so anyway, he is this famous scientist. He's going to be high on the hit list for the Germans now that Denmark is under a real occupation. And so he flees. Now, at this point, he had helped other scientists flee from continental Europe, but it's his turn. And he is able to successfully escape to Sweden. He's flown to the United Kingdom. Ultimately, he comes here to the United States. Now, as he's leaving Denmark, he sent a cryptic message, I believe a telegram message, to Sir John Cockcroft in the United Kingdom. And it just said something like "Tell Maud Ray Kent." Well, Cockcroft gets this, and he has no idea what to make of it. So he apparently assumes that Maud is some kind of reference to the secret nuclear weapons work or something that's going on at that point in time. As it turns out, that's not what Maud is. Maud Ray was a woman who was a former governess of the Boer's children, and he wanted to know Maud Ray, who lived in the county of Kent, wanted to let her know that he was on his way out of Denmark. This story is recorded in a pretty obscure but very good book by Frank Zaz, but he was Frank to us. He was a professor at UNM, called British Scientists on the Manhattan Project, I think there. So you can probably check it out from the library if you would like to see the source for that. We don't know for sure which one of those stories is true, but I always err on the side of more interesting, right? So that is the answer, or kind of not the answer to that first question. With Einstein, I don't know. Remember early on, there was no great interest in building atomic bombs. The Manhattan Project was very small. And Einstein, I don't think that there was particular interest. I don't think that the stars aligned. I'm sure that there's probably somebody who's done some real scholarship on why he wasn't involved in the Manhattan Project. There's probably a specific answer. Of course, I mentioned before that, a lot of foreign nationals became heroes within the Manhattan Project. That doesn't mean that they were necessarily just welcomed in without looking into backgrounds and different things like that. General Groves, for instance, did not like Leo Szilard. He kept Szilard at arm's length throughout the project. Leo Szilard knew about it. He was at Chicago, but he was never heavily involved. And I think that's largely because General Groves didn't want him to be involved. I don't think that there was any such animosity toward Albert Einstein. But again, if you have anything else to add to that, I don't remember. That's an obvious and good question. I should know more about that. Sorry, I don't have a better answer. So I'm 0 for 2 so far. Michael, let's see if we can do a little bit better.
Yeah, so the next question is kind of related because the contribution of foreigners is pretty notable in this project. The next question is from Anthony Sabello. It says, do communist sympathizers like Oppenheimer still get negative security clearance reviews today? And maybe you could talk a little bit about the involvement of foreigners, the involvement of people from Axis countries, and the involvement of people with communist sympathies like Oppenheimer.
Well, today, I'm pretty sure that if it can be factually demonstrated that you are a sympathizer of world communism, they're probably not going to give you a clearance. Now, I'm not involved in that process. There are different people who do that and make determinations at DOE. And so I don't know. But yeah, I mean, like, if you're interested,
but at that time, Alan, historically, at the time that the Manhattan Project was going on.
Right. At the time, that was that too was something that was really not encouraged. You'll remember that we were allies with the Soviet Union once we joined the war in the end of 1941. Moscow was being besieged by the German army at that point in time. We were allies, but we were not friends. Okay, we did not like the Soviet Union. We did not trust the Soviet Union, and I think that for most historians believe that the Cold War started after World War II. And the Cold War, as we know it and talk about it, did start after World War II. But, let's face the reality here. The Soviet Union and the United States had chilly relations from the time that the Soviet Union came into existence. We didn't even acknowledge the existence of the Soviet Union until 1933. And so the Cold War has some very deep and very icy roots. And for a few years in time, Hitler brought us together. Okay, and so it was an ideology that we were not. We just had the common enemy of Hitler. It was not an ideology that was any more tolerated by the government at that point in time. I think more people were interested in it because of the Great Depression, as we talked about before, but the government is probably not going to give you a clearance if they think that you were interested. Again, they didn't want to give Oppenheimer a clearance, for instance, at that point in time. And so there was, I think, because we were at war, because we were on the side, because we were allies with the Soviets, there was some more tolerance built in there. I mean, not only was Oppenheimer here, but his wife was here at the laboratory. His brother Frank was here. His brother Frank was in charge of the safety committee for the Trinity test. And so not only here, but Frank was, as a former member of the Communist Party, was involved in the work. His wife was here as well. And so it was, again, a lot of this is kind of subjective. And that's why I would say, talking to the security people, looking at the history of this, I think Alex Wellerstein I know Alex Wellerstein just came out with a book on the history of classification, for instance. I've not had the opportunity to read it yet. I don't know if it touches on this. But communism was certainly something that was frowned upon heavily, at least at that point in time. But a lot of people who had communist records had left the cause for the purposes that we talked about during the presentation today. So hopefully I didn't just make that more confusing. But Michael, what was the other part of the question there with foreign-born scientists?
Well, it's kind of related to the next question.
Okay.
So a lot of, like, as you know, a lot of people here at the lab are foreigners, and they like to contribute to our mission in the ways that they can.
Yes.
There's and so for the Manhattan Project, there was a lot of people that were involved with the Manhattan Project that were from foreign countries. So Devin Kimball asked a very relevant question about our northern neighbor, Canada. Since Chalk River was on the Manhattan Project map, how did they contribute, and how much did they know about the project that they were contributing to
Well,
out of Canada?
right. So it was a relatively small piece of the Manhattan Project, as you may know. And what I'm going to do here is refer you to a paper that is about to come out by I think that actually our director, Tom Mason, he is one of the co-authors, if again I'm not mistaken. Of course, Tom was born in Canada. Also, Madison Andrews and Madison's significant other. I think that they are the three authors on this, and it will talk about Canadian contributions to the Manhattan Project. That is going to be published, I believe, by the American Nuclear Society later this year. For those of you who have access to the Red Network, it is part of a compilation that includes classified papers available from the online vault. Okay, and so for those of you who don't have Red online access, which may be a pretty healthy portion of our student group today, you can, if you send me an email and you'd like to read that paper and start digging into the more specific contributions there, I think that I can get a copy from Madison. But do look for that. Again, I think that it will be published by the American Nuclear Society later this year. And I got to see, I haven't read the final paper, but we did a little bit of work, a little bit of research in the National Security Research Center to try and track down reports and other fragments of information to help tell that story. And so I think you'll be really excited to see that article. And again, I can help you track down an advanced copy if you would like.
Excellent. Thanks. That's a great answer, Alan. So the next question is of interest to our people that are interested in history here at the lab, and a lot of the people that have been here for a while, or who are native from this area. Juan Sandoval asks, before LANL existed, there were native New Mexicans living in Los Alamos. So what happened to the people there? And also, what was LANL's or Sitewise relationship with the people of northern New Mexico, if your history goes back that far?
Alrighty, so I can tell you a little bit about that. And again, I will also refer you to some of the real experts on this as well. Before I forget, I mentioned the homesteading book earlier. That was put together by three authors. I remember at least two of them. Ellen McGee. So Ellen is a friend of mine. She is a retired historian from the laboratory. You can still find Ellen in the phone book, though, because she's a consultant to the NSRC. You can talk with Ellen. You could send me an email. The other author I know of, Judy Mason. Judy's now retired as well, but it's a lovely book. I think that right now it's only available as a PDF. But if you would like to see pictures that tell the homesteading era story leading up to the Manhattan Project, that's what you want. And it is again, you can write to me, you can write to Ellen. We will set you up with a copy of the homesteading book. The Now, when we tell the quick version of this story, it's always like, oh yeah, the laboratory came to town, the lab was built. We kind of glaze over this. I don't think anybody was particularly excited about getting getting kicked out of their home. I mean, would you be, right? Uh, with you can find a little bit of correspondence pertaining to the boys' school. In fact, I think that the eviction notice that the boys' school received is somewhere over in the county archives. I've been trying to get a copy of it from our friends at the Los Alamos Historical Society. Of course, they have been dealing with COVID and restricted hours and access and things like that. But anyway, hopefully I'll get a copy of that soon. And if you want to send them an email and say, "Hey, Alan told me about this. Can I get a copy?" you know, Go ahead. We'll let them know this is a popular document to advertise what they have there. But that eviction notice is over there. I think that the story of the boys' school pretty interesting. We don't have time for it now, and I'm not an expert on that aspect of our history either. But anyway, I think that it was basically viewed as, well, the nation is at war. We understand, not too happy about this. Have to pack up a school that people had worked on for years and years leading to that point. But again, during World War II, I do think that among many people, at least, there was a great sense of national urgency and patriotism there that was shared to some degree or another by people. And so, you received compensation for your property and different things like that for your losses. It was the same for the homesteaders. They were compensated. Many of them were not too happy about that. Again, as you might imagine, and I think some of that is covered in the book that you can have access to. If I'm not mistaken, further compensation was provided to these families and their descendants within recent memory, within the past 10 or 15 years, if I'm not mistaken. Ellen will know a lot more about that as well. But that was not really getting us off to a great start with the neighborhood. I think that relations with neighbors like San Ildefonso were pretty good in the early days. Maybe you see some pictures of celebrations that were held after the war, feast days, different things like that. There are pictures of Enrico Fermi with the famous potter Maria Martinez. Pictures, I think, of Norris Bradbury at a gathering that was hosted at San Ildefonso. That's kind of waxed and waned over the years. I mean, we do have an office today at the laboratory, community relations, that specializes in this type of thing. And so again, I would refer you to them to find out a little bit more about where things stand and where we hope to take things in the future. But it's kind of dependent on the time. It's dependent on the neighbor. It's dependent on, back during World War II, the war's over, we won. New Mexico made a contribution, but along with that, there are consequences. Back during World War II, as we've talked about already, there were evictions. I mentioned fallout from Trinity. There were accidental releases of materials into the environment during World War II here at Los Alamos. Things were buried. These don't really make you a great neighbor either, at least in the eyes of your neighbors, for pretty good reasons here as well. So again, things change and continue to change over the years, and so hopefully that gives you a pretty good flavor at least. There's more stories about this. And with my answers, a lot of the stories that you'll read over the history of the laboratory, I think they're true, but they read a little bit more like propaganda because it only focuses on like the good stuff and we did this. But there's multiple parts, multiple sides to that story as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Alan. So it looks like that's all that we have for the questions for this talk, and we'll go ahead and end here. And I second Daniel Archulette's comment about this was an excellent talk, really great talk, Alan, and we all look forward to part 2 tomorrow. You all should have received the web link, and it'll be at 1:30 tomorrow on WebEx. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Michael. I'm looking forward to seeing you all back then. Take care.